The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm happy this afternoon to rise to speak to Bill C-88, an act to amend the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act and the Canada Petroleum Resources Act. And I'd like to start by saying that the overall position of the NDP on this bill is that Northerners know best how to manage their own resources. And we'll be supporting this bill at second reading, but feel there are some areas where important improvements could be made. This bill is part of a series of measures that the Canadian government has made over the past half century or so to bring more democracy to the north and end the colonial style of government that has been in place there since Confederation. It seems, though, that every step forward has some sort of steps backward, and this bill is perhaps no exception. It's a bit of an omnibus bill, and I just want to make a point now with regards to the member from Kamloops Thompson Caribou's speech about, pointing out that the NDP and Liberals voted for C-15. That was because it was an omnibus bill. It was a bill on the devolution of powers to the Northwest Territories. We're all in favor of that, and then they tacked that poison pill on the end of it of cutting down on the Indigenous rights. So that's why we supported it, even though we had concerns with the other part to it. And so this is a bit of an omnibus bill. It sets out to do two rather different things. One is to repeal parts of Bill C-15, the Northwest Territories Devolution Act, passed in the last Parliament, and a second to bring into force an announced moratorium on oil and gas exploration and development in offshore waters in the Canadian Arctic. And Bill C-15, passed in 2014, as I said, was a bit of an omnibus bill as well, and the bulk of that bill dealt with the devolution of powers from the federal government to territorial government, and the general public opinion in the North with this was a great thing. It was reversing the tide of colonialism and giving back more powers to Northerners to manage their own affairs. But the second part of C-15 went back on that, eliminating 4 regional land and water boards and replacing them with a single super board. Those 4 boards were created out of land claims agreements and negotiations with various First Nations in the Mackenzie Valley area, and the new super board significantly reduced the input of those First Nations would have on resource management decisions. Now, since 1967, much of the political history of the Northwest Territories has been one of decolonialization through the devolution of powers from the federal government, and there have been 4 settled land claims in the Northwest Territories since then. The Inuvialuit, covering the northern parts of the Mackenzie Delta, the Beaufort Sea region, and the Northwest Territories portion of the Arctic Archipelago, was settled through the Inuvialuit settlement. This region is outside the areas covered in the regional land and water boards covered in C-88, but does bear on the second part of the offshore oil and gas exploration. The Gwich'in, which covers the southern portion of the Mackenzie Delta and the northern part of the Mackenzie Mountains, the Satu Dene Métis, covering the area around Great Bear Lake and in the adjacent Mackenzie Mountains, and the Salt River Treaty Land Entitlement, covering an area near Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. And this agreement doesn't involve the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. And there are 2 more agreements in place now in the Northwest Territories, the Delaunay Self-Government Agreement for a community covered by the Satu, and the Tlicho Resources and Self-Government Agreement covering the area north of Great Slave Lake. So these agreements are modern-day treaties which create and confirm Indigenous rights that are protected by Section 35 of the Constitution. The Gwich'in, Satu, and Tlicho agreements contain provision for the creation of a system of co-management boards enacted by the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. And on each of these boards, 2 of the 4 members are from the Gwich'in, Satu, or Tlicho. So there's 4 members and a chair. 2 of those 4 members are appointed or nominated by the First Nations themselves. So they have an equal partnership in those decisions. In parts of the Northwest Territories where there's no settled land claim, the main board created by the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board, is in operation. in the Inuvialuit settlement region, the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency conducts environmental assessments. Now, on December 3rd, 2013, the Harper government introduced Bill C-15. And this was primarily meant to implement the provisions of the Northwest Territories Lands and Resource Devolution Agreement. But it contained this poison pill, as I mentioned, in the form of changes to the Land and Water Co-Management Boards created by the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. The Harper Bill eliminated the regional boards in favor of a single super board consisting of 10 members and a chair. And the C-15 also changed the process by which members of the single board were appointed and only provides for a single representative from the Gwich'in, Sato, and Tlicho. So these groups have gone from having an equal partnership, 2 of 4 members, to only having 1 in 10 members on this super board. These changes were wildly and widely unpopular in the Northwest Territories and contrary to the wishes of Northerners, as reported by a consultation process launched by the Conservatives prior to bringing forward C-15. And the member previously mentioned the McCrank report. You know, there was a consultation process about that report, but the First Nations, when told about these options, said, don't do this, we don't like it. It's not consultation if you just tell First Nations what's going to happen. You have to try to make accommodation, and that's exactly what did not happen here. So here's some quotes about what First Nations and Métis groups thought of this. Jay Karen from the Métis Nation said, "It's very frustrating when you're at the table and you think you're involved, only to find out that your interests are not being considered seriously." Bob Bromley, an MLA in Northwest Territories, said, "The federal government's proposal to collapse the regional land and water boards into one big board is disturbing, unnecessary, and possibly unconstitutional. A single board does nothing to meet the real problem, failure of implementation." Dennis Bevington, the former MP for the Northwest Territories, said, "I don't think it's fair to the people that went into the devolution agreement, people like the Tlichon who agreed to the devolution deal because it had some separation from the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. I think it's inappropriate." So Bill C-15 received royal assent on March 25th, 2014, and shortly afterward the Tlichon and Sato launched lawsuits asking for declarations that portions of the Devolution Act are of no force or effect, and an interim injunction to stop the Government of Canada from taking steps to implement those provisions of C-15 that affected the regional board structure for the Mackenzie Valley. And on February 27th, 2015, the Supreme Court of the Northwest Territories granted that injunction to the Tlichon. And so the federal government immediately began appeal proceedings to lift the injunction, but with the defeat of the Harper government, Canada began consultations with Northwest Territories Indigenous governments and the government of the Northwest Territories, and that has resulted, of course, in Bill C-88 before us here today that reverse those changes to the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. So, Mr. Speaker, last night I happened to be sitting on the plane flying from Toronto to Ottawa next to Grace Blake. Grace is a Gwich'in leader from Chikajik. She was very happy to hear that Bill C-88 would keep the land and water boards in place, and I think her feelings are representative of most residents of the Northwest Territories. And a representative from the Tlichon area, Ryan Fiquet, said that the current land and water board's composition reflects 50-50 decision-making between First Nations and the federal government, and I think the super board's proposed structure would have changed that, and that's why various parties voiced their concerns. So I'm going to switch now to the second part of C-88, the part that deals with the Canada Petroleum Resources Act. And as other members have mentioned here, this began back in late 2016 when the Prime Minister was meeting with President Barack Obama, and they both gave what was called the United States-Canada Joint Arctic Leaders Statement. And that Barack Obama said the U.S. was designating the vast majority of U.S. waters in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas as indefinitely off limits to offshore oil and gas leasing. And at the same time, it seemed that Canada felt obliged to designate all Arctic Canadian waters as indefinitely off limits to future offshore Arctic oil and gas licensing to be reviewed every 5 years through a climate and marine science-based life cycle assessment. The Prime Minister made this decision without properly consulting any form of governments in the North. As was mentioned, he gave everybody a phone call 20 minutes before the fact. Northwest Territories Premier Bob McLeod reacted by issuing a red alert calling for an urgent national debate on the future of the Northwest Territories and saying that the Prime Minister's announcement was the re-emergence of colonialism. He added, "We spent a lot of time negotiating a devolution agreement. We thought the days were gone when we'd have unilateral decisions made about the North in some faraway place like Ottawa, and that Northerners would be making the decisions about issues that affected Northerners." In response to the Prime Minister's unilateral action, the Premier of Nunavut, Peter Taptuna, said, "We do want to be getting to a state where we can make our own determination of our priorities, and the way to do that is to gain meaningful revenue from resource development. And at the same time, when one potential source of revenue is taken off the table, it puts us practically back at square one, where Ottawa will make all the decisions for us." The Nunavut also raised concerns. There was a total lack, there's a quote, "There was a total lack of consultation prior to the imposition of the moratorium. This and the subsequent changes to key legislation impacting our marine areas are actions inconsistent with the way the Crown is required to engage with its Indigenous counterparts." And that was a statement by the Dwayne Smith, who's the CEO of the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation. And Mr. Speaker, I happened to talk to Mr. Smith about this subject when I was at the Generation Energy meetings in Winnipeg in October 2017, sort of a year later, and he was still hopping mad about this. So in response to Northerners' concerns, Canada began a consultation process and agreed in October 2018 to begin talks with the territorial governments and the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation to reach a co-management and revenue sharing agreement. But meanwhile, the current oil and gas development moratorium remains in place to be reviewed in 2021. So I'd just like to switch now to, how can this bill be improved? Well, for one thing, despite the fact that the government supported my colleague's private member's bill on putting the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous people into every appropriate legislation that this government produces, there's no mention of that at all in this. And again, when I talk to First Nations leaders, they're very frustrated with this government over all the talk and no action on that regard. The second place that it could be improved, and I'll mention this a little later, is through a real commitment for intervener funding in the review processes that this bill puts forward. There's no mention of that, and that's a real critical part of any proper consultation. And outside this bill, there's still so many more important areas that this government could be taking action on, such as First Nations drinking water. 73% of drinking water systems are considered at higher medium risk, according to the Public Parliamentary Budget Officer. Indigenous housing. Estimates from the First Nations Financial Management Board peg the housing infrastructure gap on reserve at between $3 and $5 billion. And this is the main thing that Grace mentioned to me sitting next to me on the plane last night. Is her concern is housing, housing, housing. Indigenous schooling, whether you look at physical infrastructure, teachers, or dropout rates, critical gaps remain. And less than a quarter of Indigenous students who started grade 9 went on to finish high school. We've really got to step up the game and fix these gaps. Stop infighting Indigenous people in court. Currently, there are thousands of court cases going on between Canada and Indigenous people, including 528 specific land claims and 70 comprehensive land claims. fix the high cost of food in the North by replacing with the Nutrition North program with one that actually assists Northerners in affording nutritious foods. And finally, settle the two outstanding land, resource and self-government processes in the Northwest Territories. These are the Decho and the Akaicho. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to finish by mentioning a process that really brought northern resource management issues, and specifically management issues in the Mackenzie Valley, to the attention of Southerners, and radically, I think, changed the way Northerners took hold and control of their resource decisions. And that was the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry, or the Berger Inquiry as it's popularly known. And it began with pipeline plans in the early 70s to bring oil and gas from Prudhoe Bay in Alaska across the north slope of the Yukon to the Mackenzie Valley, and also two separate plans for pipelines down the Mackenzie Valley into Alberta. And the Liberal government at the time commissioned Justice Thomas Berger to create an inquiry that would look into these situations, figure out what Northerners wanted, what the impacts of those projects would be on the North, and how the government should best proceed. So Justice Berger started in 1974. He traveled to every community in the area, 35 communities in the affected region. Everyone who wanted to testify was heard, and several days were usually spent in each community. For instance, in Old Crow in the Gwich'in Territory in northern Yukon, 81 people out of a population of 250 testified, many in the Gwich'in language. 5 other languages made up the testimony from the other communities. Anyone who wanted to speak was heard carefully and respectfully. And the Berger Inquiry also set the standard for intervenor funding. I mentioned that earlier. Money used to allow concerned citizens to travel and speak at the hearings. In 1977, Justice Berger released his findings. He found that the environmental impacts of a pipeline across the Arctic slope of the Yukon would be too great to justify the benefits. Instead, he recommended that much of that area be protected from development. So in 1984, Ivavik National Park was created in the Inuvialuit settlement region, and in 1995, Vuntut National Park Reserve was created in the Gwich'in area of northern Yukon. And I've had the pleasure and privilege of visiting those areas. In 1983, I spent the summer doing biological surveys in the Old Crow area and spent 10 days on Herschel Island, just off the coast in the Beaufort Sea. And it was a wonderful time on Herschel. There was Liz Mackenzie and her 2 daughters were the only permanent residents there. They were Inuvialuit, who kept us well fed with bannock and fresh Arctic char. I rafted down the Firth River in 1995, saw muskox, caribou, the porcupine caribou herd, which calves in the Arctic coast of the Alaska, migrate through this area. And because of those protections, the porcupine herd is literally one of the only caribou herds in Canada that is still doing well in these days. Most caribou herds are declining drastically. So as for the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline, Justice Berger pointed out that land claims negotiations were just taking place in the Mackenzie watershed, so he placed a 10-year moratorium on any decision in that region to allow those agreements to be finished. So the Berger Inquiry is really the gold standard of consultation in Canada. If anyone in the government is interested in what consultation, good consultation, proper consultation looks like, this is it. People were heard and accommodations were made. And young community leaders, if you look at the leaders of today in the Northwest Territories, many of those leaders began that career by being inspired by leading their people in the Berger Inquiry. And I'll just read from an article that Ian Waddell wrote on this, mentioning a few of those. Nellie Cornwallier, who worked for the Committee on Original Peoples Entitlement, the Inuvialuit group. She later became the Premier of Northwest Territories. Dave Porter used to carry equipment for the CBC crew, became a great Aboriginal leader in the Yukon. Jim Antoine, then the young chief of the Fort Simpson Dene, became Premier of the Northwest Territories. George Erasmus appeared before the inquiry for the Indian Brotherhood of Northwest Territories, later the Dene Nation, became the head chief of the Assembly of First Nations, and on and on. So, Mr. Speaker, I'll just finish by saying Northerners, regardless of dissent, overwhelmingly support land, resource, and self-government agreements and the co-management processes created by them. Northerners see these processes as decolonialism. Resource extraction is the only viable form of economic development available to Northerners, and while they want strong environmental protections for any resource development, Northerners want to be equal partners in making these decisions. So we support Bill C-88, and we support this process of devolution of powers to territorial and Indigenous governments that must continue to eliminate colonialism within our country. Thank you.